Good day from Sydney, Australia. I want to thank the organisers of ICRA for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today about a very important and timely issue. How long before we have killer robots? The video you're seeing is a promotional video produced by a Turkish arms company of some fully autonomous kamikaze drones that they've developed in-house, and that are set to be deployed very shortly on the Turkish-Syrian border. These drones are fully autonomous and use face recognition and other AI software to identify, track, and kill people on the ground. So one answer to my question of how long before we have killer robots is that they're already here. And this is something that troubles me and many other people greatly. It was an issue that was brought to my attention back in 2017 by our colleague Noel Sharkey, who wrote an op-ed in the Guardian newspaper warning about this road that we were about to go down. Shortly after his warning, a variety of NGOs like Human Rights Watch got together and formed the somewhat provocatively named Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. And shortly after that, an issue that has been discussed, it started to be discussed at the United Nations and other fora. I became very active in this topic in 2015 when I helped to organize an open letter that was released at the start of the ICRA conference that year, that was signed by thousands of researchers in AI and robotics, warning about the arms race that was beginning in this space. And that letter garnered lots of attention, headlines around the world. I quickly learned that having famous people like Elon Musk, Steve Wozniak, and the late Stephen Hawking sign the letter was very good for generating publicity. But I think what's much more significant was that the letter was signed by thousands of you, other people working in the field, who understood the technology and its limitations, and perhaps understood better the dangerous road that we were starting to go down. Subsequent to that, I was invited to the United Nations in New York and Geneva to talk on the topic. But 2 years later, I was becoming somewhat frustrated with the speed of progress and with the direction that the talks were going in. And I thought it was important to demonstrate that it wasn't just academics like myself who were concerned about this, but it was also people in industry who were building these technologies as well, who were equally important. So in 2017, again, just before the ICRA conference, at the start of the ICRA conference, I organized another open letter. This one was signed by 117 founders of robotics and AI companies around the world. I still had learned that lesson of having famous people like Elon Musk, who of course had founded, one of the founders, co-founders of OpenAI, who had signed this letter. But many other companies, ClearPath Robotics, Blue Ocean Robotics, many other AI and robotics companies very willingly signed this letter, showing that this was a matter that concerned them like myself. Now, of course, the campaign to stop killer robots is rather provocatively titled Killer Robots, Not Lethal Autonomous Weapons. That's good for getting the attention of the press and other people. And it does create this misconception that it's something like Terminator that we're warning about. And of course, it's nothing to do with Terminator. Terminator, like robots, may be hundreds of years away, if ever. It's much simpler, more mundane technologies that are much nearer that trouble myself and many other people. We warned in 2017 that there would be an arms race, and you see that arms race happening. This is some more vision from that Turkish arms company of another kamikaze drone that they developed that can fly in swarms. And we see around the world countries and arms companies starting to develop these sorts of technologies fully autonomous weapons where there is no human in the loop. We see this in every theatre of the battle. In the air, we see a number of autonomous drones being developed. The UK has its fully autonomous Tyrannus drone prototype. US, Israel, Russia, various other countries have fully autonomous drones. You also see it on the sea. This is the US Navy's first fully autonomous ship, the Sea Hunter. Last year it made a very significant voyage fully autonomously from Hawaii to the west coast of California without any human interacting. You also see it on land. Russians have some fully autonomous tanks, the MRK-25 tank that you see here. But also under the sea, this is Boeing's Voyager submarine. It's a submarine the size of a bus that can cross an ocean, the Pacific Ocean, fully autonomously. In 2018, we put together a video. I encourage you to go and see the whole video. I don't have time to show you the whole video. It's called Slaughterbots. It outlines some scenarios of how fully autonomous drones might be used to assassinate people. When we put the video out, it was premiered at the United Nations in the middle of that year. When we put the video out, we got quite a bit of pushback that this was alarmist. These were technologies that were still a long way away. But a couple of months later, just 2 or 3 months later, we did see an assassination attempt being made on the president of Venezuela with a drone, not fully autonomous, but as far as we know, it was not fully autonomous. There was still some remote piloting going on. But it demonstrated that these would be weapons of terror, the perfect weapon to be used by terrorists. Difficult to attribute. We have seen a number of attacks in the Middle East and elsewhere where drones have been used, where it's not actually certain who it was attacking you. That's the perfect weapon for terrorists, difficult to attribute, to be used to cause trouble. My colleague Stuart Russell has pointed out that these would also be weapons of mass destruction, that you'd be able to scale warfare in a way that only other weapons of mass destruction can be used. You could, with a limited amount of money, you could buy yourself or build yourself 100 or 1,000 drones, put them in the back of a truck and drive them into the center of a city and cause mayhem that way. Scale warfare, industrialized warfare, in a way that only other weapons of mass destruction allow us to fight war. That previously you would need an army of soldiers to follow your evil way. Now you would just need one programmer. They would therefore be terribly destabilizing. We already live in a terribly destabilized world, but these would lower the barriers to war, would be the sorts of weapons that would fall into the hands of bad actors, rogue states and terrorist organizations, and used to make the world a much more terrible place. Now, I want to discuss some of the arguments for lethal autonomous weapons. It's worth pointing out that this is not a black and white issue. There are arguments to be had for and against lethal autonomous weapons. I believe there are many strong arguments, legal, technical, ethical, for the necessity to ban lethal autonomous weapons. But it's worth acknowledging that there are serious arguments for the deployment of lethal autonomous weapons that need to be considered. But I expect, if you do consider these arguments, as I have done, that you will come to the same conclusion that I have, which is that the weight of evidence is strongly in favor of the necessity of banning them. Now, it's also worth pointing out that one of the mistakes people make is to consider that the arguments are static. They're not static. This is a dynamic problem. And as the technology matures, the arguments will change. But one of the arguments, and I want to consider half a dozen of the most common arguments put forwards for lethal autonomous weapons. One of the arguments put forwards is that robots will be more efficient. That's certainly not true today. We don't know how to build lethal autonomous weapons that will be more efficient than humans. And it's certainly the case, the evidence is strongly against that. The Pentagon papers that were leaked about the statistics and the use of semi-autonomous drones in Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrated that at the present, 9 out of 10 of the people being targeted were not the intended target. Now that's why you've still got a human in the loop with their immense situational awareness. So if we were setting out to build such technologies and make them fully autonomous today, 9 out of 10 would be our target, our aspiration. We would be struggling to make 9 out of 10 mistakes. We would make many more mistakes. Now, of course, I can envisage a future in which these technologies are more efficient than humans, that make fewer mistakes than humans. But now a different argument comes into play, that we would now have terrible weapons, that would be impossible to defend yourself, would completely change the very nature and character of war, and not in a good way. The second argument, common argument that gets put forward by proponents of these autonomous weapons is that robots can be more ethical. But warfare is a terrible thing, and warfare is a terrible thing, and terrible atrocities, ethical violations get committed in the heat of battle. And that if we had robots fighting wars, well, we could program them very precisely to follow international humanitarian law, and that these atrocities, ethical violations, would not take place. Now, there are two fundamental flaws with such arguments. First, we have absolutely no idea how to program robots today with international humanitarian law, with the principles of proportionality, discrimination. And it's not clear to me how long it will be before we can. I can envisage a future in which perhaps we have worked out how to do such programming. But certainly the weapons that we see being deployed very shortly, like those being deployed by that Turkish arms company, will not be abiding by international humanitarian law. Nevertheless, I can envisage a time, perhaps in the future, where we could program robots with IHL. The second fundamental flaw, though, of this argument is that all computers that we know can be hacked by someone, and that there are plenty of bad actors out there that will remove any ethical safeguards that we manage to program into such robots. And so we would end up with some terrible weapons again. A third argument, perhaps the most common argument I hear for the necessity for lethal autonomous weapons is actually a moral necessity, that we could actually just have robots fight robots, and therefore we are morally obliged to develop and deploy them to remove humans from the battlefield. This, I'm afraid, is a terribly naive idea of what warfare is. Warfare has become something that is fought in towns and cities against civilian populations. And these are weapons that would, I'm afraid, be used against women and children, against innocent civilians in towns and cities. The nature of warfare, the asymmetric nature of warfare we fight today, is increasingly fought in and amongst and against civilians. The sorts of people that we end up in conflict with today are not the sort of people who are going to sign up to "it's our robots against your robots." There's not a separate part of the world called the battlefield where we fight wars. It's fought in cities. It's fought, sadly, as we see in places like Syria and elsewhere, against civilians. If it was just this, then we wouldn't even need to have lethal autonomous weapons. We could just decide it by a game of chess or a game of tiddlywinks. But the people that we end up in conflict are not going to sign up to such rules, and it's foolish to imagine that they would. Another argument is that we can't ban these technologies. That's misunderstanding the call here. We're not calling to ban these technologies. These are the same tracking software that will identify pedestrians, that will track them and will avoid them in your autonomous car, that will be going into autonomous drones, that will be identifying targets on the ground, that will track them and destroy them. We're not calling for a ban of such technologies. It wouldn't be possible to ban such technologies. We're calling for a ban on the deployment of such technologies, just like we didn't ban chemistry when we banned chemical weapons. We banned the deployment of chemical weapons in the battlefield. And the final argument put forward is that, well, bans just don't work. That is a terrible misreading of history. Bans do work, not perfectly, but we have a number of technologies, chemical weapons, blinding lasers, cluster munitions that have been relatively successfully banned, not 100% successful. Last time I was talking at the United Nations was when there was a chemical weapon attack in Syria. And sadly, occasionally they get used, but the world unites together, condemns those actions, applies diplomatic, financial, military sanctions against the people transgressing those rules. And so that's what we could hope for here. We could hope for a ban on the deployment of lethal autonomous weapons. That would have the success of ensuring that such technologies were not developed and sold by arms companies. Arms companies do not violate the UN bans on chemical weapons, on cluster munitions, and the like. That would ensure that they don't end up in the arms bazaars and black markets of the world, and would make the world a safer place. I'm pleased to report that the UN is discussing these issues somewhat slowly, in my opinion. 30 nations now have called for a preemptive ban. I'm not sure that we can still consider it to be a preemptive ban, given what I've told you about what's happening on the Turkish-Syrian border. That includes the European Parliament, so therefore the European Union, the African Union, so a significant umbrella of nations around the world has called for such a ban. Of course, there's significant pushback still from a number of nations, from the United States, sadly from my mother nation, the United Kingdom, from Israel, from Russia, and to a certain extent from China. So there's a lot still to be played for. But I'm optimistic that in the long term, like every other weapon of mass destruction, that we will decide that this is a terrible way to fight warfare and one that we do not need. We have plenty of other means of deterrence to police the world with. The tech community as well is starting to embrace these issues. We've seen, for example, workers at Google, at Amazon, and Microsoft and elsewhere are starting to lobby within their organizations for responsible deployment of the sorts of technologies that we've been working on. We saw this with Project Maven, the Google employees. We've seen this with Amazon workers and face recognition software. And we've seen this with Microsoft employees and the use of the cloud. So I want to end my talk with just some beautiful vision of Paris, the city that sadly most of us won't be seeing in all its beautiful splendor, because the world didn't in time listen to the warnings of scientists. I think that's a suitable and apt message for my talk, that we should ensure that the world does sit up and listen to our warnings, and to outline 3 ways in which you, as individual scientists, can act to try and ensure that we do end up in a good place where there are not lethal autonomous weapons in deployment around the world, killing innocent civilians. So 3 simple ways that you can act. One is by doing your research responsibly. There are many ways in which we can act in a responsible way. Many of us have significant freedoms in the choice of the problems, research problems we get to work on. And so I think it's important that we think carefully and choose wisely and responsibly the problems that we work on. And at the risk of being somewhat critical of the robotic community, I did do a Google search before this talk of robotics for good. And there were 300, I'm pleased to say, there were 300 million hits. But equally, I did a Google search for AI for good, and there were 3 billion, 10 times the number of hits. And I'm not sure that AI is 10 times more dangerous to the planet than robotics. So I encourage you to embrace ideas like robotics for good, for the good uses. There are plentiful good uses of robotics, even within military settings. I always like to remind people that robots should that no one should ever lose a life or a limb clearing a minefield. That's a perfect job for a robot. There are plentiful other examples of the use of robotics that will keep people out of harm's way. What was the first action that we can do? The second is to use your voice. I've been very pleasantly surprised how much of a voice scientists do have in our society. I've ended up in some quite remarkable and surprising places. I've ended up in the office of the Under-Secretary General, the number 2 in the United Nations, the person overall responsible for disarmament for the planet, and had a meeting for half an hour where he asked for my opinion, scientific advice as to what the UN should be doing in this space. And so scientists do have a voice. And if there's one positive thing that will come out of this pandemic, is that I think the world is increasingly turning to listen to scientists, to listen to the warning to scientists. And so we have, I believe, a unique moment, an opportunity to be heard, to argue for the responsible use of the technologies that we're developing. That's the second action that we as scientists can make. The third is to remember that we are also citizens of this planet as well. And the one other way that we get to change the planet is by how we vote and how we spend our money. And that we should therefore vote and spend our money wisely. And I encourage you to consider carefully the next time you get to go to the ballot box, and the next time you get to open your wallet. And that has consequences. So thank you very much. I hope you all keep safe. And I look forward to seeing you all in person the other side of this pandemic.